I just said I'd look into what's going on with this water rumour, this sewage rumour, and we found a few things. First of all, the Environment Agency's annual test found very high levels of flame retardant in the water and mercury. And actually water quality had been downgraded to its lowest level in 2019. We also found the Brunel University study where they found I think it said an incredible 10,000 microfibres per litre of harbour water in 2019. Then, of course, we bumped into Alex and Alex's feminisation study of the little shrimps and how they were changing sex in the harbour. And, of course, there are really the tens of thousands of hours, actually, of untreated sewage dumps into our water. So we knew, and I think people just generally knew something wasn't right. So the group of us wrote to the local MP. We got the standard letter back saying, it's not a designated bathing water, so therefore we can't do anything. We thought this wasn't right. We then, I was actually part of listened to a presentation by the Conservancy, and at that time, this is 2 years ago now, the line was that there's only a nitrate problem in the harbour. In fact, the line was that most of the nitrates come in from the solent on a rising tide, rather than being created around here. So overall, the Conservancy were giving the line that overall excellent water quality. But we knew that wasn't the case. And then I think luckily or fortunately, whilst we were doing this work and doing some background work, Natural England did their condition review and published it of Chichester Harbour. And that was headlined as unfavourable, declining in its classification. And it had been declining for 40 years, was the headline. That's quite a turning point. The other turning point, of course, was good old Southern Water and their performance. And their £90 million fine, the worst environmental crime in the Environment Agency's 25-year history. And there were about 7,000 incidents they were fined for, of which several hundred were now harbours here. And that was between, if I remember it right, 2010 and 2016. So we sort of said to ourselves, what can we do? Time to help ourselves. And when we were doing this background work, what we'd realised is something very obvious, actually three things. First of all, there was a lack of evidence, actually, about what was in our water. That was not just locally, but nationally. And then also that Langston and Chichester, despite being one body of water, didn't really talk to each other. So we wanted to bring the two harbours together more. And of course, as evidence here, lots of interest groups, all sort of thinking the same as we were thinking, but didn't have anything to pin their colours to. So we formed the Clean Harbours Partnership with a strong sort of theme of collaboration. This is between those interest groups that showed so much interest, sailing clubs, residents associations, local businesses, etc. And we wanted to really leverage the power of the people. And that's what we've been trying to do over the last 18 months or so. We also wanted to cover both harbours, which I hope you'll agree we are doing. Our values, there were at the time a couple of quite shouty groups out there, campaign groups. And we just thought that you can keep on shouting, and it's just opinions, it's not fact. So we wanted it to be evidence-based, all of our work, and we wanted it to be professional and also non-political. Just so you know, we are a not-for-profit organisation. We are a community interest company, and we set on or adopted a strapline of investigate, inform and improve. And that's what we've been trying to follow for the last 18 months or so. And then I was lucky enough to bump into Alex again. And from discussion, we got this proposition together called Project Spotlight, which you will obviously be aware of, and that's the reason for coming this evening. But obviously science-led to create the evidence, fill the gap. 20 sponsors, very highly collaborative, and there are about 40 citizen scientists. Many of the scientists are sitting in here in the room now. And we looked across both harbours, about 20 odd sites. We thought it would be of local significance, but talking to Alex and Tom, maybe Alex will mention something later, it's actually got national significance as well. And there were 5 key components to Project Spotlight, just to remind everyone. First of all, data analysis. This was really looking at the flows through the sewage works and illegal dumps. There's pre- and post-storm sampling, eDNA testing, some E. coli testing, and some biopsies on 5 different species. The other thing that came to into plain sight, I suppose, is that in many ways southern water has become the lightning conductor to this problem of pollution. But it's not just southern water. There are water users ourselves. There's landfill, leaching, and the lack of management of the landfill sites. Farming is a big one, and of course highway runoff. It always interests me that we have the clean air zone in Portsmouth about the air we breathe, but where do the particulates land? On the road, and they then drift down and they end up in the bottom of the sea. So highway runoff is another big one, a bit of an undiscovered one, I think. But overall, the research suggests that in big sewage plants, about 50,000 different substances flow through. In the smaller ones, about 3,000. So we've got that contrast here with, let's say, Bosham at 3,000, and let's say Big Buds Farm at 50,000 different contaminants. And yet, the Conservancy were measuring just 3 things, just 3 types of E. coli. And the Environment Agency were measuring about 40 different things, but very occasionally, so once every year or 2 or 3 even. This study tonight, thanks to Tom and Alex, looks at about 500 different chemicals, which is a major leap forward, but still actually not enough. So to take that strap line, investigate, inform, improve. On the investigation, we started 18 months ago with Professor Peter Hammond. Peter is a professor of data based in Oxford, and he has done a lot of work and actually talked to the Environment Audit Committee about the illegal spills. So he's been informing the Environment Agency about these illegal spills because they didn't have the information themselves or the way to analyse them themselves. We helped him with that work, and he's found since 2000 or the end of the court case, the criminal activity that Southern Water were doing, he's found about 142 local illegal spills here. They're probable, or potential is all we can say, but they are very probable illegal spills. And I'm hoping, or we are hoping, that this work is actually being worked on by the Environment Agency. They won't say anything, but hoping there'll be some bigger legal cases because of it. Just on the investigate, of course, good old Buds Farm, you'll see it, recognise it, bottom left. It's called Buds Farm number 2. Just so you know, year to date, there's already been 50 discharges. And that's about 700 hours, and it's a big beast of a pipe, so a lot of sewage coming out of Buds Farm. There's a picture of Bianca there, who is sort of up to her neck in it, taking the samples. And if we work around, different, it's worth saying, just different samplers. So Richard is here tonight down at Bosham. We have Beth over at the oyster beds over at just by Langston Bridge. Bianca, myself. Claire, I haven't seen Claire yet tonight, I think she's here, and Ginny over at H&O Bosham Home. I'm not sure you can see it too well, but top left is a picture of some fungus that we found in the River Lavant when we were testing it. So it wasn't just the harbours, we were actually looking at what flows into the harbours. And the River Lavant there, we found this reported to the Environment Agency, and it's led to some action, which I'll cover a little bit later on. Okay. But all the time we've been thinking, how do we make a difference? How can little old us make a difference nationally? And the way we've been doing it is through really nudging, I suppose, and informing the public as well as informing actually the politicians through the newspapers and the press. We've had quite a lot of success at it, dare I say it. At top left, Bianca and I on the boat with Josh, who I saw here. Josh, one of the samplers from the Andrew Simpson Centre. And we went out with the BBC a month or 2 ago. We know that got about 10 million hits. We were lucky as well. We struck some more luck in that Fergal Sharkey, who has sort of become the guru or the leading spokesman for this work. He came down and met us and spoke on the subject as well, which was good. Bottom left is Ruthie, locally here. She's out being interviewed by the BBC. Ruthie is our youth ambassador. And then to the right next to it is Alex being interviewed on the riverbed by the BBC, on the riverbank by the BBC, and myself on the TV as well. And in the middle of above, because of the drought, we were delayed a lot with our results. We thought, how do we keep the momentum flowing? So because we've learned so much, we know when the E. coli is there, we know where it comes from, so we just went out and measured it. And Langston measured at 760 times the acceptable level under the Bailey Water Directive. What we didn't say was actually Thornley, 1,800 times. And we thought people would believe it, actually. But that's what the lab results came back at. Top right, you probably, many of you will have seen this video, so it looks very small, like a postage stamp here, but we think that video alone, which was Mike Owens at Hayling Sewage Watch plus Chris Beardsall, who did it, we think that got probably about 30 million hits. Of course, all this change isn't just us, but we are playing a part, I think. That's really what our message is. We also have been on Channel 4 and dispatches, we've been in The Guardian, The Times, The Independent, and just 3 weeks ago in The Week, in the science section of The Week. And what we've tried to do throughout is not to scaremonger, we've tried to keep the reporting sensible, professional, and therefore we've linked up with the quality of the BBC, despite their problems at the moment. We were also in Le Monde, actually, and ZDF, the German sort of BBC copy. So we've been all over the press, I hope, and we've helped to keep this situation going on. Just to finish off then on this little introduction, so if you investigate, inform, and then improve, I just wanted to look at some of the improvements that have happened locally and nationally. So just locally, people power mobilised, most definitely. There's been riots on the street. No, there hasn't. But there have been protests on the street with May Day and the good work that they've been doing. And I do believe that work has really affected the local elections recently. So this is us influencing. I mentioned the River Lavant before. We reported that the fungus to the Environment Agency, and very quickly, as if something was a real problem, Southern Water has spent about £1 million on those works. So it's a great improvement up there, but it is still not very good. But it's a great improvement. I also mentioned all the different sources of pollution, one of them being ourselves, and there's a great deal of work being done by people like this club, like Final Straw Foundation. Final Straw Foundation, Bianca and Lizzie are the founders, had an eco conference for kids just a few weeks ago. Tremendous success. Great to educate the kids on this stuff. Chai Fed have set up a new environmental group under Sue, who's here tonight. I also think there's been less discharges. Very hard to prove. But I think it rained about 10 days ago and I kept looking at Beach Boy. Nothing came through. So I'm sure they are working harder. Now they know everyone's looking, they're working harder and not studying so much. They say they're going to spend about £20 million locally on capacity and storage tanks and the like, but we haven't seen it yet. But they say they're going to do it before 2025. The Conservancy did a big U-turn to their credit, and now there's a great organisation, Chaperon, many of you would have heard about, them doing some really good stuff, and that's all to be communicated in the next few months. Indeed, Conservancy have even restructured and now have a new recovery officer. Just the wording just shows that things are starting to change. Langston Harbour Board, forgive me if anyone from Langston Harbour Board here, but really has been sleepwalking into financial difficulty for a number of years, and there is a strategic review at the moment. I just hope they can make something of it. I hope it's got the ambition to move on from where it is now. Another thing's happened very recently. Portsmouth City Council and Havant have started E. coli testing in Langston Harbour, which is fantastic. It started. It is scratching the surface, though, as you'll find out in the next hour. Another great initiative, which is Solent Seascape. I'm not sure if Louise is here or Luke's here, but Tim is here, who's looking after the seagrass project. And okay, hi guys in the back. Yeah. So this is a $5 million restoration fund that's been set up. So some really good stuff happening. I saw Jane here is looking after Chasm. Unfortunately, Chasm didn't get the $1 million research grant that they were after. However, there's really good signs that they will get other grants. So some really good things happening. Nationally, the interest keeps on going. I think the debate is going to move from the number of combined sewage outfall events. It's gone from there to the dividend payouts and high salaries. It's now obviously into the water company's financial instabilities. And Southern Water announced this weekend that they need to raise another £550 million. That's on top of the Thames Water debacle that's happening at the moment. So this debate keeps moving on. A couple of other smaller things have happened, but it's really important the Environment Agency can now keep the fines. The 90 million went to the Treasury, so it went into this big black hole. But now the Environment Agency can keep the fines. So the fine at Gatwick last week that you would have, I'm sure, seen over £3.3 million is going to be kept by the Environment Agency. The government have also said that there are combined sewage outflow targets, and they said there will be £3 billion spent by the end of 2025. Whether that happens, I don't know, but we don't see it locally, do we, yet? The Environment Agency have increased the number of farm inspections, very, very important when you're looking at these different pathways, from 300 to 4,000 last year. So that's a real marked difference. So just moving to the future, just to finishing off, I think the next phase, the things to look out for, is certainly governance in the water industry is a big one, not just Ofwat, but in the Environment Agency and the water companies themselves. I think we'll see more Environment Agency legal cases against the water companies, probably up north rather than down here, because Southern Water and Thames Water have had theirs, and they'll be concentrating on United Utilities and the like. And of course, what we've always wanted is for each of the political parties to have a very good water plan in their manifestos. And now the time is ripe, 18 months, 15 months from the election, that we can start to keep the pressure on to make sure that the three main political parties have these really good water policies. So in summary, there's an awful lot happening, but there is a long way between the good ideas and making a real difference. But we've got to keep the pressure on, and that's really our key message going forward, keeping the pressure on.
Thanks ever so much, everybody, for coming, and a huge thank you to Rob and Bianca and Final Straw as well, and all you volunteers and donors that contributed to this project. I'm going to leave Tom to give some of the main headlines of the results. What I'm hoping to do is give you the context to this in terms of why we're interested in these particular pollutants. And if we just go on to the next slide, if we could. This is probably the video that you're all familiar with. You probably saw, and it broke on the news, Chris's drone footage. And this was brilliant for us because we've been concerned about these stormwater overflows for many years, and if you walk your dog around these harbours and things, you just don't see them when they're going off. You need to be above to be able to see that plume and appreciate that's quite a few tens of thousands, 40,000 people's more of sewage coming out of that pipe, and it's 2 metres wide and 2 metres high, and it comes out at an almighty rate. If you go on to the next slide, please. And obviously it's not just happening around here, and this is just Southern Water's old Beach Boy screenshots, because they've changed it, because some of these have turned white now. But it's happening all around the country, and People quite rightly were concerned about the human health effects, but we were also concerned about the wildlife health effects. And it wasn't just the E. coli and the bacteria and the pathogens and things that are in the water. It was all these pollutants, and it's the pollutants you can't see. And it's great in the sense that people can get emotionally attached and angry and things when they see sanitary towel products and cotton buds and condoms and things on the shore, because there's signs that sewage has gone out there. But you won't see the pollutants that we're going to talk about today, and they have quite dramatic effects on wildlife. So we click on to the next slide. So that sewage will contain pharmaceuticals. It will contain all the pills that we take. They don't get fully broken down in us. They go to a sewage treatment plant, and then they don't get fully broken down in a sewage treatment plant. And if that sewage treatment plant is not very efficient, or the infrastructure hasn't been kept up to date, and they can't treat it in a storm, then it goes straight out, completely untreated. Next slide as well. And there's clearly all those domestic home products that we use, all our cleaning agents and our shower gels and soaps and things, they all go down. And if they don't go through a sewage treatment work because of a storm, they just go out. So if you read your bottle of washing up liquid, it says it's quite harmful to wildlife on it, and it is. Next slide, please. Now, this is quite unprecedented, I think. The Environment Agency and the financial regulator Ofwat are investigating every single water company in England and Wales. The UK House of Lords is investigating the financial regulator Ofwat. The new Office of Environmental Protection is investigating the performance of the Environment Agency, Ofwat and DEFRA, and there are 2 High Court judicial reviews in progress into Ofwat and DEFRA's stormwater overflow plans. And as you know, as Rob may have mentioned, there are some water companies that are in a bit of financial difficulty at the moment. So it's quite understandable why you lot are quite angry, and so are we. Now, Portsmouth and sewage is not a new thing. These are newspaper clippings from 1903 and 1904, where people were concerned then about the effects of pollutants going out into the harbours, and the fact that it was affecting the oysters, and the fact that if it was affecting the oysters, it was affecting human health. To the next slide. This was an article in 1933, where I think this was under the sewage treatment plants were under city ownership, and they had identified that the population of Portsmouth had grown, and they needed to increase the capacity of the sewage treatment plant to go along with that. It's a shame that the water companies hadn't been thinking that more recently. Otherwise, we may not have been in the situation that we are in now. If we go on to the next slide. Now, this is quite interesting in the sense that in 1937 and 1957, there were articles about the fact that they were concerned about the sewage, either that's out in the Solent gets sucked in, or the sewage in the Langston Harbour and that wasn't getting washed out. So go on to our next slides. So it's quite hard to get these models off Southern Water. They've refused every time I've asked for them, but other people have got hold of some models of their sewage from their stormwater overflows. So this is one from Bud's Farm number 1 in Langston Harbour. And the sewage comes down, but it gets down to about here, and then the tide turns and it comes back up and it gets squashed up, and then it comes into Chichester Harbour as well. We don't know whether, if that went on for several days, whether it would make its way out and down Hayling Island. If you go on to the next slide, and you've got one from Chichester Harbour, you've got the entrance to the Chichester Harbour, it kind of goes back and forth, but it finds its way down off Selsey, and you've got another one up at Thornham that kind of goes down and then gets sucked up the other branches of the estuary. If you go on to the next slide, you've got one off Gosport that gets sucked into Portsmouth Harbour, and if it goes on long enough, it gets sucked into Langston Harbour as well. And the next one, and that's the main outfall, and we don't really know where that one goes as well. But the point I'm trying to make is the fact that some of the stuff that's outside comes in, and some of the stuff the inside doesn't get out, which means that the wildlife that are in there are kind of living in a cocktail of these chemicals all the time. What's the next slide? So if you let me entertain you with a little bit of history of where I've come from. I'm from Swansea, and when I was working for Swansea Council as an environmental health officer, we were looking into the fact that the sewage was discharged from, anybody knows the Mumbles in Swansea, it was discharged out here, but they built a state-of-the-art sewage treatment plant 12 miles round Swansea Bay in the other direction. But the problem for Welsh Water was it was still failing at lots of different sites here, and we were looking into wrong connections, and they were closing off some of the stormwater overflows at that time. But the one thing that did happen when they stopped discharging all the sewage off Mumbles Point was all the marine life came back. There's a pier there, and all the oysters came back, all these little cushion stars and all this wonderful wildlife that had disappeared when the sewage was there. It just came back by itself. As soon as you took the pressure off, it came back. And that is the key. Is that going to happen here? If you go on to the next slide. As you know, we've got colleagues here from the Blue Marine Foundation that are doing some wonderful work in trying to restore the oysters with the University of Portsmouth in the harbours around here. And if we go on to the next slide, and I saw Tim's here as well, you've got Hampshire Isle of Wight Trust as well doing some amazing work trying to restore the seagrass beds here. And to give these projects a chance, we really need to be stopping washing all our sewage over them. Onto the next slide. Rob mentioned that it's not just sewage that we have a problem with here. There are old historic landfills. You might recognise this up near Bud's farm when the wall broke and then the sea came through. That's washing straight over that old historic, or close to that old historic landfill. Probably move it on to get the noise going. And those historic landfills have got loads of chemicals that we banned ages ago because they're really toxic, and they're still affecting our wildlife today, and they will find their way out into the environment, I fear, because we've got so many coastal landfills and the sea level is rising locally. This is some work that we've done just on hydrocarbons, and we've done a heat map here, and you've got like a big hot spot of hydrocarbons probably coming out from the Bud's farm, but you'll get another one just coming close to the M27 there. There is a lot of road runoff the M27 there, but there are also some CSO outlets there as well. And we're now concerned that the oil and tyre particles and things are harmful to our wildlife. On to the next slide. Rob already mentioned that Chichester Harbour was categorised by Natural England as unfavourable and declining. I think Langston Harbour is in the same state, but they didn't have the historical data to actually show the change, and I think if they did, it would be red as well. On to the next slide. There have been several studies around the UK that suggest that most UK shellfish waters do not consistently meet the regulatory standards for fecal indicator organisms, and they're sort of downgraded as a lower class shellfish, which is clearly not good for us to eat because we're more likely to get ill. So next slide. This is some work that got a little bit of press around here, is the fact that we're looking at sperm counts in little amphipods, and they're little crustaceans about that big that you find under the seaweed all around our harbours here. And it's quite tricky, but you can do a sperm count on one of them, and this line here is Langston Harbour. So this is the weight of the animal, this is how much sperm it has, and the bigger the animal, you might expect more sperm than a smaller animal. The ones that we get from Langston Harbour was the lowest of any sites, and we looked at some pretty polluted sites around the UK, but there's not a relationship between the weight of the animal and the sperm count, which we didn't understand why. But we don't know what's causing that, but we thought we'd flag it in the hope that Monday we'd try and find out. Next slide, please. And that's obviously the BBC did a little article on the concerns over that. Next slide, please. Now, I want to talk a little bit about endocrine disrupting chemicals. And this story first came about partly because of this drug, diethylbestrol, that was given to pregnant women from around about the 1950s and 1960s. And it makes bigger and stronger babies, and it stops abortion and miscarriage. And it was given, it's thought, maybe to 10 million women. And we've gone to the next slide. What they didn't fully appreciate, and the effects were not necessarily seen in the mother, but they were seen in the children. And sometimes it was the children, when it wasn't until they went through puberty that they started developing various different cervical cancers, breast cancers, testicular cancers. And studies with rats and mice now have all gone on to the next generation. So it was the mother who was exposed, not the children, but the children's children are now in rats and mice being shown the effects of their grandparents being exposed to these pollutants, there are even some indications of another generation again. So this is called transgenerational effects of pollutants. Next slide. A boy born today will have, on average, half the sperm of their grandfather. And they think this is related to pollutants as well. So if we go on to the next slide. Our sperm counts are dropping by about 1 to 2% per year. And there's this threshold at around about 40 there on the graph, where we're getting close to where they're worried that there may be fertility issues. And some of these seem to be associated with the levels of chemicals in plastics in mothers' urine during the second trimester of their pregnancy. And some of these plastics have got anti-androgenic, anti-male hormone activity to them. Next slide, please. This is the cost of these chemicals. There's one thing, there's a human element to it, but there's a financial cost in terms of health services as well. So these endocrine disrupting chemicals and the diseases and the problems they cause to the health of humans are thought to cost 340 billion in the USA and 270 billion in Europe. So there's a real need, there's a benefit financially to try and get these chemicals out of our waste. Next slide, please. And this is a study from Tom's University from 1998, some years ago now, where they started downstream of sewage treatment plants. They were finding intersex fish. And there were fish that were being feminized because of the estrogenic chemicals that were coming out of the sewage treatment plants. So you've got the downstream was much higher than upstream, and then you have control lakes where there's no sewage going into them at all. Next slide, please. And this is what they were finding. They were taking a section through a rudd and a roach, through its testes, and there was ovarian tissue growing in their testes. They were taking flounder, and these are taken from the tine and the teas. This is its testes, but inside the testes there's ovarian tissue growing there. Next slide, please. If they caged fish, in this case trout, downstream of sewage treatment plants, they didn't have to cage them there for very long, just a couple of weeks, and they would start to feminize. They could take a blood sample, and a male trout would have yolk protein in its blood, and they're only supposed to have yolk protein if they're a female that's producing the yolk for their eggs. Next slide, please. The Canadians went a step further in this experiment, where they had permission to add synthetic estrogen from the contraceptive pill to an entire lake to see what it's had, because they was concerned whether they could work out what population level effects of these chemicals might be. We all knew that, yes, you could find intersex fish downstream of sewage treatment plants, but what really effect was it having on the environment? So they knew the population of fish in this lake. They had permission to add contraceptive pill to the lake at a concentration you would find downstream of a sewage treatment plant. Move on to the next slide. And it was Lake 260. It became famous. They've got lots of lakes where they've added mercury and all sorts of different chemicals to, in having these large-scale experiments. They were chucking bucket loads over it in this little boat, and they're going around in a rib, trying to stir it around, so to try and get an even concentration. So the next slide, please. And these are their two control lakes. You've got females and males, and then you've got two control lakes, and this is their experimental lake. This is before they added the estrogen, and this is after they added the estrogen, these really high bars, and they were measuring the amount of yolk protein in male fish. And you can see that they had to break the bars on their graphs because the scales just go so high. And those fish died within 3 years. The population just collapsed. It just feminized the fish, and then they all died. Next slide, please. Thankfully not in this country, but in other countries they pump hormones into cattle to make them grow faster and bigger. We know that you put those steroids, testosterones, into cattle, they wee it out, and it can affect the behaviour, the reproduction of various different fish if that goes into a river. These are lipid regulators like statins. You give these to a fish and it does all manner of different things to their biology. This example we have is diclofenac. You may have heard of diclofenac, a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. Most people kind of know it from Voltarol gel if you've had a bad back or something like that. This was responsible for a decline in over 90% of the vultures in India and Pakistan, because they used to give it as a veterinary drug to the cattle, and the vultures would strip the cattle to the bone if the cattle died. But nobody knew that diclofenac was really toxic to a vulture. And this is a log scale. But they nearly wiped out the vulture populations in India and Pakistan. It wasn't until they banned diclofenac use in the cattle that their numbers just started to go up again. But this is just an extraordinary example of a chemical that we probably thought was quite harmless that comes out of our sewage treatment plants, having a dramatic effect on wildlife. But on the next slide, if you go over, the knock-on effects of that vulture population declining were extraordinary. So there was an increase in feral dogs because there was no vultures left to eat the cattle that were building up. As a result, there was an increase in rabies in the human population. There was a decrease in water quality. They measured an increase in overall human deaths above the average in the populations where this happened the greatest. And there was a greater increase in conflict between humans and big cats, because the cats were coming into the towns and things to eat the feral dogs. So the encounters between these cats was going up. So it's an extraordinary knock-on effect of a pharmaceutical drug that you can buy in your pharmacy just down the road from here. Next slide, please. And then we go on to antidepressants. So antidepressants, if I haven't depressed you enough, sorry. Certainly in the UK and in the US, antidepressants are taken quite widely, and we started getting concerned. A lot of work had been done on estrogenic substances and things like contraceptive pill and HRT. We knew that antidepressants control lots of neurohormones, and neurohormones in marine life control lots of interesting things like growth and reproduction and behaviour and things as well. So we got interested in that. If you go on to the next slide, and of course the press had a field day with this, and they kind of made a joke out of it, but thankfully it got the message out there that there are these drugs getting into the environment, and that was in 2010. So go on to the next slide. A study that came out quite recently, it started looking at the drugs in wildlife, in rivers, in the same way that you're going to hear about in our coasts. And what they worked out is in the insects that this duck-billed platypus eats, the amount it eats a day of insects with the amount of antidepressants in the insects, it's getting about a 60% equivalent dose of antidepressants per day. And nobody quite knows what the effects of duck-billed platypus on antidepressants are, but I guess if they're on it for a long period of time, it could well be damaging. Next slide, please. So I mentioned the press had a bit of a field day. Prawns on Prozac, whatever next, crabs on cocaine was the New Scientist article when we got this out. And that's where Tom's work came in. So if you click on the next slide, lo and behold, Tom back in 2019, I guess, had found cocaine in loads of shrimps, and of course that made the headlines, and you'll hear a little bit more about those drugs again in a bit. Next slide, please. So the study that we've done here, and you've all helped out with, has been done on a global scale as well. So this paper came out, and it was awarded best paper in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, which is a really top journal. But you can see the amount of authors on this paper and the amount of work that went into it to take samples all the way around the world. Next slide, please. I'm not expecting you to interpret this graph other than to say that they found lots of different compounds in rivers in different places around the world. What they found is it was the low to middle income countries which had the worst problem, because they had better sewage treatment in the higher income countries and they would have more access to pharmaceuticals. In the very low income countries, they didn't have access to the medicines. But in the middle income countries, they had access to the medicines, but they didn't have suitable sewage treatment facilities. So they were always much higher. But they found lots of evidence that the concentrations that they're finding in rivers all over the world should be harming wildlife. Next slide. In Switzerland, this was a study that was done on a little amphipod shrimp, a little crustacean, and this is upstream data versus downstream of sewage treatment plants, and they looked at 8 different sewage treatment plants. This one at the bottom was before and after they'd done an upgrade to the sewage treatment plant, and you can see that if you invest in sewage treatment plants and put the money in, you can get rid of lots of these nasty chemicals, and each one of these colours represents different things. So the blue is pharmaceutical, corrosion inhibitors, biocides, plant protection products, personal care products. So you invest and it comes down. Next slide. The UK water industry, looking at Switzerland, seeing that it was investing lots of money, wrote a report, and their conclusions were it would not be suitable for the UK. And they said to get it up to a higher spec would cost everybody £4.5 to an extra £4.50 or £5.40 per year on top of their bills. Now, if you look at how much they're talking about putting up our bills quite recently, that's quite small, I think. But the reason why they didn't think it might work here is because we produce a lot of sewage sludge which we put back on our fields. These new processes to upgrade sewage treatment plants would produce a lot more sewage sludge, whereas in the Switzerland example they incinerate it all, whereas we put it back on land. Which is another problem because there's a lot of chemicals in that sewage sludge which are forever chemicals, which are now being talked about as getting into our food supply. Next slide, please. So Q, collecting samples, which Tom is going to chat about. 288 water samples that you lot collected from 22 sites. Next slide, please. One other thing that we did do, and this was just a test to see, as a novel method of looking at pathogens in our environment, we tried to do some eDNA testing. So you literally get a water sample, you squeeze it through a filter here, and you send that filter off to a company. It tells you all the species of DNA that you find in that water. So that was done in Langston Harbour, and we found 25 species of fish in Langston Harbour. If you go on to the next slide, I'm going to take a glass of my water. So the first 2 lines are clean water. The second 2 lines are treated effluent, and the third ones are untreated effluent. And because I couldn't get last year a storm, because we had that drought and there wasn't that many storms, Southern Water were kind enough to actually give me the samples for me to test out here. But what was interesting is this group was in the untreated effluent. There's lots of nasty bacteria and different groups of pathogens here. Thankfully, a lot of them disappear in just normal. They're not in normal Langston water, and they're not in the treated effluent as well. But there are a couple that hang around after treatment as well. So the standard test over many decades has been to look at E. coli, and the problem with E. coli is that it breaks down quite quickly. It dies quite quickly in seawater, about 2 days, which is why they say if there's been a storm, don't go swimming for 2 days because you might get something nasty. Because they're not just worried about the E. coli. The E. coli is just a proxy for lots of other nasty pathogens that might give you a bad tummy or an ear infection, eye infection, or something worse. But what we are hoping to do is look at a community of 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 different bacteria all at once. And I think we've got enough evidence to show that this could be a promising way forward. But unfortunately, it is £300 a sample, so it is an expensive way of doing it. But we think we'd like to push that a little bit further. Next slide, please. My last one before I say thank you to you all, and this is, Rob mentioned that the press that we've had from this, and this is just the BBC press and the results of that quite recently when we released the fact that we're finding cocaine and methamphetamine and those drugs in the marine life in Langston and Chichester Harbour. This is our university's press office. They run a report on where the report has gone. And this is international. And what they do, they work out the average readership of each one of those media outlets, whether it be TV, radio, print, or online. And they had an estimated reach of 2.94 billion from the article from Langston and Chichester Harbour. And the reason they do that is because it's revenue for the university as well. They can think, if you put the university out there, then they think somebody might want to go to that university as well. So they have a key interest on where their stuff goes. But this study, Project Spotlight, has put the spotlight on this issue in Langston and Chichester Harbour to, they estimate, 2.9 billion people around the globe. Now, I'm not sure they all read it, but it was a lot of people. By university standards, by the stories that put out, this is one of the biggest ones I've done. Next slide, please. So I'd just like to finish by thanking again just all the donors for this project, the volunteers that went out in the rain and collected those samples, and to Clean Harbours Partnership. And as with these projects, there's lots of other things that get funded in between and sort of self-supporting each other, and there's loads of other funders as well that probably should support along the way home. Thank you for listening.
This has been absolutely the biggest study I've taken on. I've done a couple of other studies in Suffolk, in Colchester and in London. Well, this was a really, really lovely study, and it's fantastic because we've got such a nice data set to work with now as well, because we had so many samples collected. And yeah, as Rob mentioned earlier as well, I don't think I was expecting it to be this big, but it is really great to have a data set like this now where we can really analyse and interpret what's going on in coastal environments. So I won't spend too much time on the contexting because Alex has really set me up quite nicely and gone into a lot of the background concerning chemicals in the environment, but I will just go into one slide just quite briefly just to say that it's really important now to start thinking about environmental emergencies, and emergency is the right word because you've probably heard a lot about climate change. You know, climate change is always in the news, it's a well-known topic. Same with things like biodiversity loss as well. Biodiversity is becoming quite a prominent topic as well. However, chemical pollution, I'd say, until recently, actually probably until the last year or so, has really gone under the radar for quite a while. There was a really lovely report produced by the United Nations, so kind of looking globally now, that was a synthesis report called Making Peace with Nature. And in this report, they recognised that there was now 3 environmental emergencies that we should be worried about. First is climate change, second biodiversity loss, as I mentioned. But here they also mentioned pollution, which is really great to see because, as I mentioned, you know, it really needs to be, the awareness around chemical pollution really needs to be talked about a lot more. There's a really lovely figure as well in this report that I like because it really shows that kind of our society, our way of life, our health, well-being is really all based on our natural resource base, which is our environment. So it's really, really important that we need to protect the environment. And so studies like this can be very, very important in raising awareness and driving change. So, and lastly, I just want to introduce this concept or this idea that was proposed probably just over a decade ago now, called planetary boundaries. So this idea is that we can operate as a society within certain thresholds or certain boundaries for different environmental issues. If we cross these thresholds, or we cross too many of these thresholds, we're going to cause unacceptable global change. So this figure is showing the boundaries for different issues, and you can already see we've crossed some of them for biodiversity loss, for climate change. We're approaching the ocean acidification one. What I want to highlight here, though, is that for chemical pollution, we don't know where that boundary is. We have no idea. It hasn't been quantified. There's not enough understanding around chemical pollution as to whether we're still in a safe zone or whether we've just actually crossed it. And actually, I saw an interesting paper a year ago now, I think it was in Nature, that the opinion starting to say that we've probably crossed it already. So it's not a great outlook, but I think it highlights that we actually need to do studies like this. We need to invest in research. It's great. One thing that's been great about this project is having citizen science involved, so having locals that are actually very passionate, that are very interested in this area. And I'd say, especially in the last year or so, this this issue of sewage dumping into waterways has certainly become more prominent. And as Prof mentioned, I think it's going to be a very interesting general election coming up. So to jump into the study now, I'll start going through some of the data. So just for the benefit of anyone who wasn't directly involved in the study and the sampling and so on, as Alex mentioned, we had surface water samples collected. So we collected 288 water samples from 22 sites, and this was across a span of about 5 days, and this was back in March 2022. Alex also collected some biota samples, so some wildlife. So we had 30 samples here from one site, which was close to Bud's farm, and this had 6 species in it. So we know that there's declining water quality in the harbours, and so we've got all the samples here that we've had to work through. So it's taken us quite a while to get through all of this data, but I'll dive into it now. You'll have to bear with me as I try and talk you through this data. There's quite a lot of data to go through. So we've got some box plots here. You're probably not going to be able to read it, which doesn't help too much, but I'll try and give you the main overviews of this. So this is the overview of the surface water samples for all of the sites that samples were collected from. And I've split this up just into major classes of chemicals. So we have pesticides on the left in the red, pharmaceuticals are in the green, and these blue ones are some recreational drugs. So the main compounds we were finding in these water samples were pharmaceuticals. We found a whole different range of different pharmaceuticals, so antidepressants, anti-inflammatories, anticonvulsants, cardiovascular drugs, anesthetics, stimulants, recreational drug. We've got a few here: amphetamine, MDMA, so ecstasy. We've got methamphetamine. We've got mephedrone. Oh, we haven't quantified mephedrone, but we've detected mephedrone. And we've got nicotine, so kind of related to smoking population. For the pesticides, again, we detected fewer number of pesticides in comparison to the pharmaceuticals. If you just click on the next. The compounds just in red here, these are a class of pesticides called neonicotinoids. You may have heard about them in the news. They cause real big problems for pollinating species. So much so that they were banned for agricultural use back in 2018. All of them were banned except for one, which is a compound called acetamiprid. So we've detected acetamiprid here, that's the furthest on the left. But there's also a few others, so we've got clothianidin, imidacloprid, and thiacloprid. So these 3 neonicotinoids were all banned, 2 of them back in 2018, thiacloprid back in 2020. But we're picking them up here in the surface water samples. These are relatively low levels, so we're looking at between 1 to 10 nanogram per litre levels for the pesticides there. So if you want to understand more about that scale, it's very, very small amount. So when we talk about nanograms per litre, we're talking on the parts per trillion scale. So a part per trillion is like looking for 1 drop of water in 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So that's the kind of scale that we're looking at here. If you can appreciate this is just how sensitive that instrument is, that LCMS instrument. So very low levels. The pharmaceuticals and the recreational drugs were a bit higher, so usually between 10 to 100 nanograms per litre level, so around about 10-fold higher than what we see in pesticides. So if you go to the next slide. So I'm also breaking this data down, same classes, so we've got the pesticides, the pharmaceuticals, and the recreational drugs, but I've just separated the data out by site location now. So for some of these sites, we're not seeing any of the pesticides, so the Emsworth Mill Pond, Esso Beach, the ASC, Slipway, and Boston Creek, we're not really picking up pesticides there. But for the other sites, we are seeing all 3 of these kind of broader classes. Again, as I showed in the last data, we're generally picking up higher concentrations of the drug-like molecules, so pharmaceuticals, recreational drugs, whereas pesticides are relatively low. There are some exceptions, so for example at the Emsworth Jetty, they're around about the same level as the drug-like molecules. So go to the next slide. So this is just the final site numbers, and just to give a bit of summary or an overview of this data here. So of all the surface water samples, we detected 54 compounds. This broke down to 39 pharmaceuticals, 10 pesticides, and 5 recreational drugs. Our method was looking for about 150 compounds thereabouts. However, applying this method to different samples, the performance of the method doesn't always work out for all of these compounds, so we have to exclude some from analysis. So we were looking for a total of 108 108 chemicals out of this 150 targets. 54 were not detected, so we didn't pick them up across any site. And this really, just to get across kind of the scale of the data that we're looking at here, to go through all of this data that I'm presenting today, I've been going through about 50,000 data points to kind of show you this overview data. So I've been burning the midnight oil, let's say, for quite a while now. But it's really nice to be able to present this. So in terms of the positive quantification, so this is where we've actually been able to determine how much of that chemical is there. There are about 2,300 positive quantifications for pharmaceuticals across all the sites, across all the days that we were looking for. 288 positive measurements for recreational drugs and 165 for pesticides. So you can see really these drug-like molecules are what we're detecting more frequently and at higher levels. Again, this is probably related a lot to sewage treatment works. The reason that these types of compounds end up in the environment is from public use. So we'll take them, they will go into the sewage treatment works, and then they will eventually end up in the environment. So if we just go to the next slide. So I usually like trying to plot an overview heat map, which is kind of a tiled thing that shows you different colours to show you the different concentrations from different sites. This is what this heat map looks like with all of this data. So there's about 15,000 data points in this heat map. So I'm not expecting you to read any of that. I just wanted to show you this is a really huge data set to be dealing with. But what I'm going to do is just pull out some site examples over the next few slides to talk through them. A bit more summary. So for pharmaceuticals, the average concentration we detected was about 6.5 nanograms per litre. The highest concentration was just shy of 1,000 nanograms per litre, and that was for bezafibrate. So this is a lipid regulator. For the pesticides, the average concentration was about 0.5 nanogram per litre, so again we are seeing much lower concentrations. The maximum concentration we detected was 123 nanograms per litre, and this was for a compound pyroclostrobin, which, if I remember correctly, is a fungicide, but it is approved in the UK for use, so it's not necessarily a big concern that it is there, as opposed to something like a banned substance, like a banned pesticide. And for the recreational drugs, the average concentration was just shy of 10 nanograms per litre, and the maximum concentration we found was just over 1,400 nanograms per litre, and that was for nicotine. So nicotine was found pretty much most sites. I just wanted to mention that for some of the sites that I'll talk through at the moment, there are low detection frequencies, low concentrations. And that's related to this drought period that was going on at the time of this sampling campaign. So this is just a figure showing the rainfall across England for January 2022 to March 2022. So for the 3-month average, it was below normal for most of the south of England. And if you went back even further, so back to kind of the end of 2021, we're seeing below average rainfall for most of the south east of England. So what this means is that where you have low rainfall events, you're likely going to get less input into the environment. That's because you're not going to get things like Rob was mentioning in his slide, things like runoff, leaching from soils, from agriculture, or from road runoff. You're going to get less input from things like storm overflow spills. So if we go to the next slide. So just a couple of examples. So we've got the Bossam Creek here, and I think that's Hayling Island Sailing Club Beach. So these are, we've got sites along the bottom here, and we've got compounds at the left, and the colours relate to the concentration of these chemicals that we've found. So just notice that on these figures, these scales will change quite considerably. So at Bossam Creek, we had very few detects, very few measured concentrations. There was a high result one-off in one of the days for naproxen, I think that was, which is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. a bit like ibuprofen, paracetamol, or diclofenac that Alex was talking about with the vultures. For the Hayling Island Sailing Club beach, again, we're seeing very few compounds that we're detecting. Most of these are not detected, so they're zero, so we haven't found anything. For a few compounds, there's a suite of 4 compounds, which is venlafaxine, valsartan, trimethoprim, and tramadol. So that is antidepressant and antihypertensive, so for blood pressure. Trimethoprim is an antibiotic, and tramadol is a strong painkiller, like an opioid, like morphine. For these 4 compounds, we actually detect them quite frequently across all of the sites that we've analysed. I'm not quite sure why this is. It could be a potential that these 4 specific compounds are not removed well by sewage treatment works, so they might have more input into the environment, and they might just show more persistence that way. Something that's quite interesting though, we have, as I mentioned, we do see nicotine quite often across the sites, even for what I would say are relatively low impacted sites. So if we go to the next slide. And again, this is just a couple more examples. So we've got Hermitage Stream here and the Langston Causeway. So again, we're seeing relatively few numbers of compounds that have been detected in that low concentration. So, you know, we're only going up to about 60 nanograms per litre and 90 odd nanograms per litre here. And that's usually only just for one compound, which is nicotine. So we're seeing elevated concentrations for nicotine, but for the rest of the chemicals, we are seeing very, very low concentrations. And so this is what most of the data is showing for the other sites that are, what I'd say is not too close proximity to wastewater treatment plants. But if we start looking at sites that were located closer to these wastewater treatment plants, then we start seeing some more interesting data in terms of chemicals that we're seeing. So if we go to the next slide. So this is the Appledram seawall, which was next to a wastewater treatment plant, as well as Firstfield Crook. The one thing to note is the concentration scale has changed quite considerably. So instead of being around about 10 to 20 nanograms per litre, we're going up to 400 and 800 nanograms per litre. So we're seeing kind of a 10 to 20-fold increase there. We're detecting that suite of 4 compounds that I was talking about. We see them at higher concentrations. We're also seeing lots of other compounds starting to pop up. So things like diclofenac, clozapine, we've seen clothianidine, so that's that neonicotinoid pesticide. And this is likely related to these sites being in closer proximity to wastewater treatment works. So if we go to the next slide as well, we can also see the impact directly of this on sites upstream and downstream of a wastewater treatment plant. So if we look at East Levant, so we've got samples that were collected upstream of the wastewater treatment plant and samples that were collected downstream of the wastewater treatment plant. So with the exception of one compound of the upstream samples, which is propranolol, so the propranolol is a beta blocker, essentially a cardiovascular drug. All of the concentrations were very, very low, so generally below sort of 10 nanogram per litre levels. However, when we move to the samples that were collected downstream of the wastewater treatment plant in this area, we start seeing much more elevated concentrations for the different compounds. I know it's a bit difficult to see, but a really nice example of this was for the compound naproxen here. So if you just click one forward, so above the wastewater treatment plant, we see almost no detectors of this compound whatsoever. As soon as you move downstream, we're detecting around an average of around about 100 nanograms per litre. So again, we're seeing as you go downstream of a wastewater treatment plant, you are getting input from even treated wastewater. If we go to the next slide. So this is just another one. This is Thornham by the Little Deep. So again, I think this is quite close to another wastewater treatment plant in the area. Again, we're seeing higher concentrations of the different chemicals that we were looking for. So we're going up to sort of the 100 nanogram per litre levels, seeing more compounds that are frequently detected as well. And if we kind of do another summary of some of this data, so if we look across all of the sites that we've been analysing for, we can see the top 20 most frequently quantified compounds. So Most of these are pharmaceuticals, but we're getting quite a different number of pharmaceutical classes in that. So tramadol was the most detected compound, so that's a painkiller opioid. Sometimes, just to note, it is hard to classify these drugs sometimes because you have tramadol that is also used as a drug of abuse, so you do get some recreational usage there, so it is difficult to just necessarily say it's only pharmaceutical usage that's coming from that. So we have venlafaxine, so this was detected, we had 260 measurements for venlafaxine, which is an antidepressant. Trimethoprim antibiotic, we've got anaesthetics, drugs for Alzheimer's treatment, antihypertensive, blood pressure. We pick up diclofenac quite often, so that drug that harmed all of the vultures. We've got lipid regulators. We pick up clothianidin and imidacloprid quite often. Again, these neonicotinoids, and a few other different compounds there as well. So if we just go to the next slide. This is a really nice data set actually as well. So this is showing the impact of a storm overflow. So we have Bud's Farm here. So this is on the left there. This was samples collected for Bud's Farm back in March in the original sample collection, and then we had some samples that were collected in August. I think this was a kind of an opportune collection. I'm not quite sure who picked these samples up, but you did well, whoever managed to get out at this time. In August there was a spill from a storm overflow at Bud's Farm, and so what we're seeing here is, compared to the concentrations that we see in the March during the dry period, very, very low concentration. So our kind of maximum is going up to about 30 nanograms per litre. Whereas as soon as we hit this storm overflow event, we're going way past 1,000 nanograms per litre. So a lot of these cases, we're seeing a 100-fold increase in the levels of the chemicals that are being put into, I think this flows out into Langston Causeway, or the Langston Silence, sorry. So if we just click one, perfect, yeah. So all water companies have to report sewage spills now. So I went to the Southern Water data set, well, I went to the government event duration monitoring data set, which you can find this data. So there's two storm overflow discharge points for Bud's Farm. The first of which is a CEO, which is a combined emergency overflow, whereas there's a settled storm overflow as well, which in 2022 spilled 52 times, and that's for a total of 650 hours. So if you just click one more. So if we look at the Bud's Farm for the settled storm overflow, I went to the Southern Water data set this time, and I wanted to see where this spill actually occurred. So on the 25th of August at 7:30 in the morning, there was a spill for 5 hours. So this spill is really where essentially untreated sewage is just being released into a receiving water body. So if we go to the next slide. And what's really interesting, what's really lovely to see about this kind of example here is that you see the impact of a spill event. So on the left there, on that heat map, we see those three samples are collected on the 25th of August, and then every three samples after that were collected on the 26th, going up to the 29th of August, so just following that duration after the spill event. So we see a couple of examples here. So bezafibrate, this is that lipid regulator. We see it spike up on the 25th of August, goes up to almost 1,000 nanogram per litres, and then the following day it's reduced. But what this is showing is that there's a high chemical load for that 5 hour spill. There was quite a high chemical load going in to this water body. Similarly for imidacloprid, usually very, very low levels of detections, as you can see after the spill event, but again we're seeing higher concentrations being put into the water. And then if we go on to the next slide, we see this for lots of other compounds at this site. So we've got things like clarithromycin, that's an antibiotic, tramadol, painkiller. We've got gemfibrozil, I think that's another lipid regulator, mefenamic acid, naproxen, these are anti-inflammatory drugs, diclofenac as well. We've got some antidepressants there and some more painkillers. But we can all see that on the 25th of August there was this really massive spike, and for a lot of this, some of these levels are going up, almost 1,000-fold. So that what's really important about this is that spills are actually leading to a really high chemical load into these areas. And as Alex was mentioning in his slide deck, the problem is that you've got wildlife that are being exposed to these chemicals at these high loads, and especially where these spills happen quite frequently, it's really not good for their health, and so there can be quite significant potential impacts for these organisms. And really this leads me into moving away from the water samples now and going into the biota samples. So just go to the next slide. So we collected a number of different biological samples. So we looked at seaweed. I've never analysed seaweed before. It's really interesting though. It was the samples that had the most diverse range of compounds. We also looked at Neris, which is a ragworm. We looked at Echinogammarus, which is a shrimp and amphipod. We also looked at oysters, crabs, and limpets as well. So this is just a kind of a qualitative screen, so just showing what compounds we've picked up across these different organisms. So as I mentioned, seaweed had the wider range of compounds that we found, going down to limpets that had lower numbers of compounds found. So just go to the next one. So I'm trying to put this again just into one of these heat maps. It's a bit easier to read than the water data because we have much fewer samples. So I've split this up again. Just at the top there, you've got the different species. So we've got crabs, limpets, oysters, ragworms, seaweed, and the shrimp samples. You've got compounds on the left there, and the different samples for each of the species. So not only in terms of that qualitative side of data, how many compounds did we detect, but if we start looking at the levels of these compounds as well, the levels of these chemicals. For the seaweed, we find elevated concentrations compared to the other species that we were looking at. Same for the ragworm as well, so these two species have higher concentrations. So they are being exposed to these chemicals. There was some good agreement from some of the chemicals that we found in the biota alongside what we found in the water. So for example, if you remember that suite of 4 compounds I was talking about in the water samples that we frequently detected, these were all detected in the biological samples as well. Interestingly, we didn't quantify any pesticides. We did detect some, but we didn't quantify anything. So they were probably just very, very low levels in these organisms. And if we think about it, the water exposure or the concentration in the water, again, was also very, very low. So probably a lower exposure for pesticides for these organisms. So for pharmaceuticals, the average concentration was around about 6 nanograms per gram. The max was 430 nanograms per gram. For temazepam is an anxiolytic, so anti-anxiety drug. Recreational drugs, the average was around about 10 nanograms per gram, and the max we found was 224 nanograms per gram. That should be, sorry, that's a typo. And that was for ketamine. So again, recreational drug, or mainly recreational drug there. If we look at the top 10 most frequently quantified chemicals here, we've got BZE. BZE is benzoylecgonine. This is a metabolite of cocaine, and we also pick up cocaine as well. So not surprised by this result, we see cocaine quite often in the environment. We see, again, antidepressants, antibiotics, anesthetics, painkillers, anxiolytics, anticonvulsants, and some stimulants. Methylphenidate is its brand name is Ritalin, so used for ADHD treatment. What's interesting is that quite a lot of these drugs, again, also are designed to affect behaviour. So Alex has done quite a bit of work looking at behavioural effects of a lot of these pharmaceuticals. So even at very, very low concentration, they can still elicit behavioural effects. And then that can have, obviously, knock-on consequences for population dynamics, things like predator-prey relationships, so it can start affecting and having more relevance for an ecological level. So if we go to the next slide, yeah, so I'm just breaking down this data again. So I've grouped all of the data into pharmaceuticals and recreational drugs on the left there. So this is across all species now. So you can see that generally for both sets of the pharmaceuticals and the recreational drugs, we're seeing up to about 100 nanograms per gram. Generally, we're finding anything between 1 to 100 nanograms per gram of these different chemicals that are just listed at the bottom here. We can also, again, split this box plot data up into species, and again it becomes apparent that we see quite higher levels of compounds and more frequently detected compounds for the ragworm and the seaweed samples, and somewhat for the shrimp samples, whereas when we're looking at oyster, limpets and crabs, very few detects, very few measurements. This is actually quite important, so if you just go forward one, and one more. So we can look at this in terms of their mean chemical body burden. So this is the average concentration of all the chemicals we've looked for in their body. So for example, seaweed, the average was about 20 nanograms per gram, whereas for the oysters, I think it was about half a nanogram per gram. So there's quite a big difference between the levels of chemicals we're seeing in these species. And the reason why that is important, because when we think about surveillance of chemicals in the environment, or we're looking at this kind of monitoring, it's really important that we pick the right species to look at chemical exposure. So it could be a case that, for example, seaweed might be a very good indicator for chemical monitoring in the environment. There's also been some really interesting work with seaweed for bioremediation. So they've looked at using seaweed to kind of remove nutrient pollution, so things like nitrates and phosphates, and they've also looked at it for removing heavy metals as well. So again, kind of doing this work is quite important because you can learn kind of different aspects like this, where you could actually start using some of these species to actually help improve the situation in local environments. So if we go forward one more, so that's most of the data that we've got so far. We've got an ongoing post-storm analysis the samples are being run as I speak. I've got a PhD student up in Manchester that is running these samples. So similarly to that storm, these samples were collecting after a storm. So similarly to the storm overflow spill, that data that I presented earlier, I imagine it will find some interesting data related to a higher chemical load into these waters. So just to conclude, there's lots of different chemicals produced and manufactured. I'm only looking for a handful of chemicals in this study. We were looking for 150 chemicals. There could potentially be thousands of chemicals. Unfortunately, monitoring just doesn't have the capacity to look for all of this at the moment. And if we look at things like Environment Agency, they will only, again, monitor a handful of compounds across the UK. So the monitoring of Langston and Chichester has revealed widespread chemical contamination for major groups of these compounds: pharmaceuticals, recreational drugs and pesticides. We found 54 chemicals across the surface water samples that were from 22 sites. The proximity of a wastewater treatment plant influenced the detected concentrations and the number of compounds that we found. We also found that CSO discharge, so with that buds farm discharge, so these sewage spills lead to a significant chemical load into receiving water bodies. For the biota samples, we detected 38 compounds in total. Average body burdens ranged from just under half a nanogram per gram up to 22 nanogram per grams, and there was a lot of species differences there. So things like the gastropods, so the limpets and oysters, as well as the amphipods, so the shrimp, showed relatively lower concentrations compared to the polychaetes, which were the ragworms, and the macroalgae, which was the seaweed. And finally, I just want to thank everyone that's been involved with this. So Rob, Bianca, the Clean Harbours Partnership, the Final Straw Foundation, Alex, has been fantastic. If anyone doesn't know, Alex was my lecturer at my undergrad university at Portsmouth. It's really weird to see your old lecturer presenting some of your research in a slide. I've had some really good partners and collaborators as well. Some of the biological work was done with a colleague up at Imperial College London. So yeah, finally, thank you all, and I suppose I'll hand over to Bianca.
Okay, so I get the easy part of the night. We are just going to do a quick roundup of what we've been talking about and some more thank yous, really, just to make sure that everybody knows how incredibly grateful we are to every single person in this room for supporting us, for sponsoring us, and for basically being the reason why we're able to do this study. So it's been incredibly important to have your support, so thank you so much. Alex, Tom, thank you doesn't seem enough, but that's all I've got right now. So, but thank you so much. Your work has been incredible. We're really excited about moving forward and all the other things that we can do. Thank you to every single sampler in this room that whatever the weather was, they braved it, they got their wellies on and waders and stuff and went out there and took those samples. And thank you to Lizzie as well for arranging all of this evening. So the invites, the everything, the slides, all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, incredibly grateful to that. What did I find kind of interesting? I'm sure everybody's got different things. I think I want to look more into the eDNA post-storm that Alex was talking about. I think that would be quite interesting for us to go to, and it'd be pretty cool to know and when that might be, of when we could get information about, when are they going to do this work on have we passed that chemical planetary boundary. I mean, that would be really interesting. I mean, gosh, I don't know if you've got any idea as to, are they looking at that now? What's the plan? But if we've actually passed that or not would be quite interesting. So, where are we going now? So what's next? So we're going to have to obviously look at the future for all of this. We haven't finished what we started yet. Our whole plan was to investigate, inform, and then improve. So we've obviously investigated, and now is the time when we're informing. We're going to be taking these results to important people that may be able to help make some decisions and some legislative change on what's happening. So we haven't finished the improve section, but we're not stopping yet, so don't worry. But we are in discussions with universities as to what we could do next for Clean Harbours Partnership, where we might want to go. I know that Alex has been very keen on looking at doing some autopsies on some larger species. So if there's a chance that we could, potentially look into that, maybe some seals or something that, that's around here. We want to look at the short and the long-term effects on urban sewage, so exactly everything that's coming out from our cities and our towns. Looking at all the restoration projects that we've got going on at the moment. There's some incredible ones out there, and which ones have been the most successful, which ones are, which ones do we potentially might be able to help in any way. And also look at some seabird shells analysis, see the presence of the pollution in them and their impacts on the seabirds. And also we're really quite keen on some highway runoff. We think that that's really quite important, that we haven't looked at a lot at the moment. But that isn't going to be solely our decision as to the way that we want to take this forward. We understand that the reason why we were in a position to be able to do this was because of all you guys and as to what you wanted. So what we would like to do is open that forum to you guys to say to us, what worries you? Where would you like to take this? What could we be looking at next? So we've got a little follow-up form for you all. It's just a feedback form. You can scan the QR code. You can do that now, or they are placed all around the room in different places. So we've got some on the notice board, one on the wall at the back, and it just gives you the chance to kind of be interactive with us and to say, yeah, I liked what you did. I liked this stuff. I didn't like that. Can we look at this bit in more detail, or just ideas or something to to move forward in the future with? So so if you don't scan it tonight, we will also email it to you, so don't worry, you will get it somehow. Okay, but we want to collaborate with everybody in the room. We want as many ideas and minds and thoughts together, because I think that's how we've got to this awesome point in the first place. It's all of us together, so that's how we want to continue. Still to come, we have got the post-storm samples. Results are going to be coming when we get there. You saw the data set. You saw how many points there were. Tom said there's over 50,000 things that he was looking at. It's enormous. It has taken so much longer than we at first thought, and we really can't rush it. It has to be, you have to take your time, you have to wait till we get there. We will let you all know as soon as that's ready. After that, there's going to be the peer-reviewed scientific paper, which should be giving us some really good sort of gravitas to the work that's actually been done. and they're going to use hopefully that paper to look at any future potential grant funding to kind of upscale all of our analysis and things that we're doing. So there is more to come. This isn't the end of it, and like we said, we haven't finished our improving section yet either. So now you guys get to say something.
A couple of questions. You found high levels in seaweed and in the ragworm, I believe.
Yes.
Both those creatures are stuck in the mud or live in the mud. Have you analysed what is in the mud under the water?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. In a separate study I did over in Essex and Colchester, what I did was a separate study over in Colchester and Essex. We looked at this multi-compartment analysis where we didn't want to just do water sample. A lot of time people just look for water samples, or they'll might look for some biological samples, but we were looking for water, sediment, as well as the biological samples. So in this study we quantified all of these different compartments, and you're picking up on the right thing there, because you're right, where these organisms are in the sediment, we think the sediment exposure is actually an important pathway for chemicals in the environment, or when you see chemicals in these organisms. So for some of the organisms, for example, like the shrimp, where you're seeing lower levels, these are really epibenthic organisms, so they're living at the bottom but on the surface, whereas where you get like the polychaete worms, like the ragworms, they actually burrow into the sediment. So definitely the sediment is a really important route to look at.
Sorry, just another one. Kind of an observation really. You said that with the rainfall, less rainfall, that affects the sample or the concentrations.
Mm-hmm.
But what we're having with climate change is when we get rainfall, it's extremely violent, and the water rushes off the land and rushes and overflows and comes out through Bud's farm every single time. So I don't. Am I wrong in assuming that we might actually be getting less rainfall, but boy, when we get it, it hammers down.
So it's definitely you're right there as well. So when you're getting kind of these really heavy periods of rainfall, that is more of an issue as well, rather than having kind of rain continuously at like lower levels, let's say, because. For example, if the storm overflows, they're going to always breach. They're always going to go and spill out. So as I showed, we're seeing that spill data has the highest concentrations, the highest chemical loads. And then if you do have these kind of really heavy rainfall events, and they're kind of periodic, there's been some research that has looked at pulsed exposure. So if you have a really high concentration exposed, then it settles down, and you have another really high exposure. That can be more detrimental for animal health. Rather than having kind of a low-level continuous exposure.
Sorry, very last. Have you stuck our drinking water through that very sensitive machine of yours?
No, I haven't yet. But yeah, no,
it'd be worth doing. I think. I'd like to know.
Yeah.
Right, I've got another one.
Oh, thank you. Wonderful presentation, thank you very much. And I'm so proud of the Friends of Langston Harbour. I'm the secretary for our part in supporting your work. But I've got two questions. First of all, you alluded to the fact that Natural England says that Chichester Harbour, and by implication Langston Harbour, has a status of unfavourable and declining. But I always understood that the real problem was the nitrates in the water, which are as likely to come directly from farmers and river runoff rather than through the sewers. And it would be useful to have some comparison of if we had, shall we say, £1 billion to spend on remediation, would it be best spent on shooting the managers of the Southern Water, or perhaps doing away with the farmers? And the good thing, which I don't hear talked about very often, but Rethink X, who are a well-respected think tank, are predicting that within a decade, about 75% of farm activity will cease, because we all get our meat from factories rather than from animals in fields. That will make a tremendous difference to the nitrates coming into the harbours.
Wanted a quick comment on that.
It's quite interesting. So there was so a lot of the time when you get these bodies like Natural England or DEFRA or the Environment Agency, I should say, who classify these water bodies, they're really only ever classifying them on a really, really small suite of compounds. So, for example, a lot of times that they're failing in the harbours is because of one or two chemicals. It's mercury or maybe PBDEs. These legacy pollutants that have always been a problem, and that's why they're failing on these. Whereas you've also got things like it's a difficult picture because you've also got where we've left the European Union now. A lot of the legislation that we had in place to kind of help the environment is really not there anymore in terms of the UK just moving away from the EU. So you had things like the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive that was set up to actually reduce nitrate phosphate levels from sewage works, but you're quite right that it could actually just be agricultural runoff that's leading to high input levels of nitrates and phosphates into the water. I'm rambling now, but in terms of a solution, Alex, I'm going to look for you to save me here.
All right. Yeah, it's a tricky one with the nitrates because I think the data hasn't been great. I think the modelling that was done suggests that the nitrates were coming into the harbours from outside. I think that's been discredited now. Southern Water have done some good things. So they put nitrate stripping on some of their sewage treatment plants, and there's really good data to suggest that the nitrates have gone down as a result of that. But of course it doesn't go down if they pump it out untreated, which they do quite a lot as well. So it only works when it goes through the system, not when it bypasses the system. With the nitrate issue, it's both, isn't it? That's the problem, and we probably can't disentangle the two, but that benefits the both of them and the polluters because they can blame each other and the can gets kicked down the road a bit. What I quite liked about this study, where we're able to pick out the pharmaceuticals which we know will come from the sewage, although some of our sewage does get spread on agricultural land, which then makes its way back. And then there's the pesticides, which you'd think would come from agriculture, but some of those pesticides will be dog flea pesticides as well, which will come from a domestic use as well.
It comes from B&Q.
And it comes from your glyphosate or whatever that you get in the supermarket as well. So although we don't think we've got glyphosate.
No, I don't know.
And, so it is tricky. But one of the things I'd be very keen on is the better picture that we have, we can prevent polluters from blaming each other and then kicking the can down the road. So the more accurate data we have, we can hold people to account. So I didn't quite answer it, but kind of gives the reason why it's quite tricky.
We've got another question here.
Hello, Tony Moss, Chitty Yacht Club. I'm pleased to say Chitty Yacht Club, together with many other sailing clubs in the harbour, represent significant donors to this project. So my question is part in two parts. A, how much money is left on the current project? In other words, what do you think you can achieve with the outstanding monies? And secondly, of course, when and if you're going to be coming back again in the future to ask for further money for funding for future projects and initiatives.
I think I'm right saying there's no money left in the current project because that was fully costed out into the analysis that went on. In terms of other projects, I'm really keen to see what comes out from that QR code in terms of what you're interested in. There are lots of things that we can be doing, and there's so many different directions to go in. I probably wouldn't want to sort of. I'm really keen on the ideas that get other people involved, and so the eDNA and the fact that the E. coli measurements that have been done by the group here to show 760 times higher than the standard level, I think was quite powerful to capture that from Bud's Farm, right next to where we know our children are going paddleboarding and sailing and everything. I think more of that would be helpful because that gets you lot involved and it's relatively cheap. Now, the work that Tom did was expensive, but it was done on an incredibly cheap budget. And if you think of that worldwide study that I showed up there, Tom did the same amount of samples as those people did on a worldwide scale, but it was done on a very fine scale here as well. And they probably had millions to do theirs.
Yeah, we were very lucky with our links with the university that we actually got all of the study work that we did at cost price. So, yeah, there isn't any money left in the pot. It is all funded out. It's all, planned out to go to the end of the study. It will cover all the post-storm samples and all of that, so we will get that. But yeah, going forward, there is no more money left from the first and original lot. And yes, we will be looking at potential funders to look at something else. But we have no idea yet exactly what that might entail until, like Alex says, we'll go through the QR code and then we'll have to look at the ideas and then cost them up in the right way. So.
Okay, in true university challenge fashion, that was your start of the 10. First of all, thank you all for some excellent presentations tonight, and there were several great takeaways. Unfortunately, the one that sticks in my mind is the year-on-year drop in the sperm count of males. So therefore, the question I've got is, which do you think represents the biggest threat to the extinction of mankind? Pollution of the water or artificial intelligence? And the reason behind that, of course, is you look at what the government is suddenly doing, how they're wrapped around artificial intelligence and started to beat up big industry, but I don't see the equivalent for the water industries and the pharmaceutical industries.
I think mankind is the biggest threat to mankind. What was the other one before AI?
Well, AI, they claim, represents a big threat to the extinction of mankind.
It's a bit Terminator 2, isn't it? It's I remember when people were concerned about nanotechnology, and they thought that we were all going to turn into grey goo then, and nanotechnology comes with hazards. Nanoparticles can be hazardous in the same way that asbestos can be hazardous. But nanotechnology has brought eyesight back to people. It's made tennis rackets nice and strong. But there's so many different examples where people were fearful, and there's so many examples you can counteract that, whereas a society would benefit. In the same way, you can't knock pharmaceuticals because they are very useful for us, and we wouldn't be here without them. And so I often feel bad when somebody comes to me and goes, I feel really bad about taking my medication, it's harmed this marine organism. I don't think we should feel bad. We have got the capacity to strip out a lot of these nasty chemicals from our sewage treatment plants. We just need to pay for it, and it's whether as a society we need to. So I'm fudging around your question a little bit about the AI because I don't know. The problem I have with AI as a lecturer is that the fact that my students use it to write essays. They're a damn sight better than I could write. And it's trying to catch them whether they've written them or not. So.
We have another question to say here. Is that on? If I turned it off?
Hello. Hi, Wes Smith, RSPB. I've spent like the last 10 years working with seabirds in the Solent, but I'm also a local resident and bring my toddler down to the shore here. So I think it's run out of power.
It doesn't like you at all, does it?
Don't worry, I can do a Brian Blessed. It's all right.
Yeah,
and so my question really is, I think like quite a few people will be aware that at the moment the government are running a consultation on the storm overflows and their future management and various different factors of that. And one of the questions on it is what considerations, what things should be tested for, basically. For example, are there any specific types of harm that should be taken into account when setting standards for them in the future? And obviously most of the concentration on that has been around nitrates and things like that. Given what you know, what you've seen, what would you suggest as well?
Want to go first, or shall I go first?
Right.
So it's the first question on that consultation that worried me slightly, in the sense that they measure the capacity to do harm because they can't measure harm at the moment. They're not measuring. They're not doing enough monitoring. So one of the issues with the water companies is they were changing the wording slightly in the sense that they weren't measuring the discharge or the impact of it. It was just how the capacity to cause harm, and then that's where this has come about. I think because it's hard to cause harm if you haven't got an idea of, one, the habitats that are there in the first place, and what degraded versus clean habitats should look like. And they need that underlying baseline work done before they can see it's being harmed. The problem we have with Langston Harbour and Chichester Harbour to a certain extent is the fact that we can't remember what good looked like when it was teeming with hundreds of boats that could fish oysters and seagrass meadows everywhere. People forget that, and there's this shifting baseline of what people think is normal, and it's not normal, and it could be a lot better. So it's kind of, and then there's the health of communities, and then there's the health of organisms. And again, we call these biomarkers when we measure something within an organism that can give us an indication of its health. There's lots of ways to go there, but monitoring, we need to fund our environment agencies better. They're so defunded. And they get a hard time, and they do a great job with a very small amount of money. And I think the money that we shouldn't be putting to the water industries, if we're going to be doing anything, let's put money into the environment agencies.
Put another one here at that.
Adrian Moss, leader of Chichester District Council. First of all, I'd just like to thank all of you and everyone else who's done all this work. And so this is partly a question, but partly a comment. First of all, you getting this evidence helps us take it further. And I think one of the things that we've all experienced over recent years, and I served on the Harbour Conservancy for many years, was we didn't have the evidence when we knew there was an issue. What you've now given us is the evidence, so that's why I thank you all. So my question to you is, what do you want us to do to help you take it forwards? Because it is, for us in Chichester District and around the harbour, it is a massive issue. It's a massive issue for residents. You've heard from Tony, you've heard from other people who live within the area. And so my question is, how do we combine with you to take this message forward? Because we can politically take it forward, and I agree with you, we've got to get that message out to the politicians in Westminster. I've already been talking to Havant, and I've been talking to other councils, new leadership across West Sussex. So we can do that, and I think, just reach out to us, and very happy to help. But with the evidence, I think we can now get that message out very strongly. So thank you very much.
Hi, this is Doyman Stepien, so Emsworth Residents Forum.
I don't think fund on the...
I don't think it's on. Yeah.
It's
Emsworth,
very
it's
nice,
working.
yeah.
So Doyman Stepien, Emsworth Residents Forum, and also with Portsmouth Canoe Club, so we have a vested interest. I think my perspective is...
Just shout.
Right. Okay.
Just shout.
So it really is, if you talk about it from a resident's perspective, it's a fantastic piece of work, and it means we are starting to get an evidence base. And then it's the so what. So what can residents in Emsworth be thinking about differently? So that they'll be wanting to look at this piece of work and say, what can we as a residents forum, we as individual residents do to contribute? The great work of Final Straw, that's really helpful. But how do we come together and have some positive actions? That will be my question.
I've got a little bit of an answer, if that's all right. Yeah. We're actually planning, as part of Clean Harbours Partnership, to be running an educational programme aside of this, where we will be, giving helpful tips and information to all of the local residents on how they can actually help. So how they can reduce the pollution in general, like if you've got old medication or anything, we're not throwing it down the toilet anymore, we're taking it back to the chemist to be disposed of. We're not using our toilet as a bin, and we're actually being careful what we're flushing down there. So little things like that. So we're planning on doing some of that stuff through the Clean Harbours Partnership, and just increase that education for the local community. Yeah. So that's from our point, but obviously I don't know if Alex or Tom's got anything else.
The Residents Forum would certainly want to support that, because that's what people are saying. What's my part?
Yeah, what can we do? Because we've all got a role to play, so I think if we all get together, we can help the sewage system as much as we possibly can.
I completely agree with Bianca on that point as well. It's about kind of education and awareness. Individuals, when we're talking about things like pharmaceuticals, for example, it's not a case of don't take your pharmaceuticals, take them, that they're beneficial, they're there for your health and well-being. But yeah, it's points like proper disposal, and that's like a local issue that you as a person, as an individual, can do. Even being involved in, for the people who helped, collect samples in this investigation, that was actually a really, really important part of this study. We would have never been able to do so many sites, so many samples, and build up such a big evidence base that we've got right now. So, initiative schemes like this is really, really important to get involved with the science. And then I suppose it really just escalates up from the individual. So you could, in terms of the political side, you could then write letters to MPs and so on. But then we on the academic side, me and Alex, will be presenting this data for probably years to come as well. So we raise it up through our channels as well. So I definitely think there is that collaboration effort, even though it doesn't necessarily seem like it right away. There's definitely a lot of communication going on through different channels, and I think raising this awareness is the important part. Anything else?
Yeah, just to add to the fact that I think as somebody that's been working on this for over 25 years and showing you studies from the late 1990s, and it comes in and out of fashion and in terms of the public engagement, but the groundswell of anger at the water companies at the moment has come from grassroots people and all these citizen science groups just like this one. And that momentum is going to take a lot of stopping now as the general elections come. And I think it's going to be so powerful going forward that we can really do some change. So I think it helps us as scientists, the fact that's going on. So please do. And I think just on the local level, one of the issues I think that we've had here, why this has gone on so long, and it's not knocking the MPs and the councillors of the different places like Chichester, Havant and Portsmouth, but I think we've been focusing on governing the land and not governing the bits of water between the land, because there's different political entities associated with them, and it's almost as if we probably lost sight of that. And I think if it was an area in the UK that just had a peninsula that stuck out, but it was sort of governed all by the same people all the way around, it wouldn't have been forgotten about so much, these bits in between the land. And in the same stretches across the Isle of Wight Gospel as well, it's kind of, people are managing their own patch of land, I think, and you've lost sight of managing the bits of water between the land, because there's not voters in the fish need a vote.
Yes, Anne Skeleton, Hailing Island Residents Association. I think you touched on what I was going to ask you about, but you're doubtless aware of Southern Water's recycling plans, and of course certainly most residents I talk to are very concerned about what the water's going to be like, and we're not just talking about taste, we're talking about what's actually in it. And I just wonder, the project has been visited by some of our committee members who were very impressed by all that they were shown. Nevertheless, we remain concerned about the high cost of those chemicals being used, etc., as opposed to any alternatives. So my question is twofold. Number one, do you think that, given all the study that you've found on the various chemicals, etc., do you think that by the time they've completed all of this treatment, that in fact we will be getting better treatment for that water, so that we needn't be concerned about it when it goes into the Havant thicket, and then it'll be treated again, I believe? Or do you think that's likely? And do you think, or can you suggest, do you know of any alternatives? Because there are talk about greener alternatives. So, and then there is something else that occurs to me as a layperson. I mean, given all that you're saying about what comes from the untreated effluent, just how much is someone like Southern Water actually removing of those in its standard treatment? So I don't know if you can answer those questions, please.
In terms of the how much they're removing the standard treatment, because you've got the different wastewater treatment plants around here, they will remove it to a different capacity depending on their makeup. And that's the problem that we have in the UK, is the fact that they're not all to a very high spec, so they're not removing as much out as they could be. and the smaller ones, probably around Chichester, are probably the ones which are probably moving possibly some of the least, because they're not as advanced a sewage treatment plant, like a big one, for instance. In terms of should we be worried about the Havant thicket, I get asked this question a lot, and I often don't know how to answer it. One of the conversations I've had with Southern Water, and I try to explain to them the fact that I think some people are not fearful of the technology, because that technology is used all over the world to recycle water and give people clean water. They're worried about the ability of Southern Water to do it. and the trust that they have in them that profit drivers will not come to the fore instead of the quality of the water. And I kind of left it with them to go and puzzle that. But yeah, the technology existed to get rid of lots of these nasty chemicals from water and make it drinkable. Yeah, do we trust our water companies and the fact that they're giving away all the profit to other people to deliver?
Okay, I think we're about it. I think that's the end. Oh, so I can. There we go. Right, we're at the end. Thank you so much to everybody for all of your time, for believing in this project in the first place. The bar is still open, so if anybody wants to go get a drink, please feel free. We'll be here for another half an hour or so, just mopping up. And so if anybody wants to come and find us, please do. But remember, we do all want to go home at some point. Okay, so.